the new jihads, Islamic modernities. Some questions about Sufism from last time. What is Sufism and how did it develop? Define dhikr, the greater jihad, fana, drunken Sufism, tariqas, and sheikhs. What are some ways that Sufism has manifested itself over Islamic history? Part 1. Colonialism. Like trying to trace the history of Christianity, exposing any universal pattern of development in Islamic history is setting yourself up for failure. Islam is nearly everywhere in some sense, and just because something is happening to Muslims in Java, that means nothing at all about Muslims in Tunisia. So, asking how Islam responded to modernity is about as rational as asking how modernity affected each country with the letter A in its name. There's just too much data to draw any useful conclusions. But if we have to ask ourselves what happened to Islam generally in the modern period, the closest thing to a universal answer we can say is colonialism happened. Colonialism is a shorthand for the spread of Western European influence around the world. In the most immediate sense, colonialism is the creation of colonies. A European power, British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Dutch, or Italian, arrives in a foreign land and takes control by military force. This happened under Napoleon, who invaded Egypt in the name of France in 1798. Or the gradual British invasion of the Indian subcontinent, which held the entirety of what is now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh by 1853. Of all the countries in the world that have a Muslim majority or a sizable Muslim minority, only two were never politically controlled by a European power, Iran and Saudi Arabia. But even in these two rare cases, Europeans took control in other ways. Colonialism wasn't always just about invasion. Colonialism also manifested itself as the economic dominance of a European power outside of Western Europe. So, for example, Indonesia, today's most populous Muslim nation, was not only repeatedly invaded by the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British between the 16th and 19th centuries, the massively lucrative spice trade was now owned by Europeans, and not the Indonesian Muslims themselves who actually produced the spices. Similar stories of economic takeovers happened across the Islamic world, most especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where Europeans ransacked the continent in search of precious metals, stones, and spices. And colonialism also meant the relocation of whole Muslim populations by Europeans. Labor forces were moved around the world to further strengthen European dominance. Sometimes this was through economic influence, such as in the case of large populations of Muslims from the greater Indian subcontinent, who moved from British India to British South Africa in search of work in the 19th and 20th centuries. And often Muslims were forcibly moved as slaves, with the most significant population being the millions of Muslims who were brought to the American continents in chains between the 16th and 19th centuries. Between 20 and 50% of West Africans enslaved in this period were Muslims. And beneath all these global transformations, colonialism spread European culture itself. Wherever Europeans held power, they brought European thoughts and cultural norms with them. So even when a European nation or company wasn't immediately present in a certain area, the thoughts and worldviews of Europeans appeared everywhere, clashing with local thought traditions or merging with them. One of these we met already, the distinctly Western Christian concept of religion. Importantly, Islam alone bucked the trend of being rebranded by a Western ism. unlike Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. Aside from Christians, of the world's major religions, only Muslims call themselves by their ancestral names. Europeans tried to introduce Mohammedanism, but there were just too many Muslims in too many places to rebrand them all. But still, Islam would be paired with the notion of religion, just as Catholicism and Judaism had been previously. Deen, the ancient Arabic word for a cultic observance for repaying your debts to God, now means religion, the belief system of an individual. Colonialism also led to the global dominance of Western European categories like science, art, race, and nation-state. While Muslims and everyone else on Earth had thoughts in their native worldviews that were sometimes somewhat like these, nearly every sizable population in the world today filters their own indigenous categories through the lens of the European colonial mind, whether they want to or not. And because colonialism was a global event occurring over several centuries, it didn't affect everyone everywhere the same way. In the case of Muslims, many rejected European influence in all of its forms as a violent, alien invasion of foreign thieves, raping, killing, kidnapping, and looting without a hint of conscience. And sure enough, if you visit a museum in Europe to this day, and you see mummies from Egypt, or calligraphic manuscripts from Persia, or Islamic ceramics from China, you might be surprised to learn how few of them were actually paid for. Other Muslims looked at European culture, and especially its technological culture, with curiosity. For most of Islamic history, Western Europe was a minor economic player with little significance beyond the Mediterranean. For the entirety of the Middle Ages, Muslim civilizations far outshined the Western Catholic kingdoms in wealth, education, technology, and political clout. For instance, in the year 1300, the West's largest library at the University of Paris was home to just under 1,100 books. In that same year, 1300, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad held at least 80,000 books. The most powerful pope was nothing compared to the caliphs and sultans of Asia and North Africa. And even the most momentous political event of the Western Middle Ages, the Crusades, made next to no lasting effect on the Islamic world that they were trying to invade. But by the 16th century, the tables were turned. The enormous monetary power of the spice trade, the gold trade, and the slave trade made the Western powers the functional rulers of the world. And this wealth led to technological developments, especially of the military variety. When Muslims, and nearly everyone else on Earth, saw the power of the European train, the steamship, and most especially the gun, well, it's no wonder that many cultures and peoples feared European power, or tried to seize these technologies for themselves. And there was also cultural power. Across time, many people equate political dominance with cultural superiority. So many Muslims thought that if Westerners were doing so well for themselves, there must be something correct about their culture. For instance, take a look at these images. These are from the 1950s and 60s. But this isn't Paris or LA. This is Afghanistan, beehives and all. And even in the post-colonial period we find ourselves in today, Muslims all over the world are affected by the aftershocks of colonization in a whole number of ways. Nearly every government in the traditional homelands of Muslims were created either by the Western powers themselves, or only came into being following anti-Western revolutions. Traditional borders between people shifted, sometimes drastically, separating people who had historically been united, or forcing together groups who wanted nothing to do with each other. Muslim populations around the world fighting over whose territory is whose, from Palestinians in the Middle East to Kashmiris in the subcontinent to the Sudanese in Africa, are fighting over lines drawn on European maps. And the interior lives of Muslims shifted in a number of ways too. What can be made of the forms of thought introduced by Westerners? Thoughts like religion, secularism, modernity, or science. Are these opposed to Islam? Can they be blended with indigenous Islamic forms of thought? Can Islam be modernized? Or can modernity be Islamized? Part 2. Political violence and Islam. Just to reiterate, there's no way to speak coherently about a global phenomenon like modernity, usually in the form of colonialism, and how it impacts other global phenomena like Islam. But we can narrow in on some groups and talk about them in isolation. So let's start with Islam and violent fanaticism first. Here we have to start by pointing out a terminology problem. These violent movements are variously called terrorists, extremists, or fundamentalists in English. But each of these terms is deeply problematic for a whole number of reasons. But the problem with terminology exposes a point. The many movements and individuals who commit violence and also call themselves Muslims aren't a block at all. All of these different groups and singular actors have distinct goals, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So it shouldn't surprise us that it's tricky to find a word that works for them all, but also doesn't apply to anything else. All these groups don't really have that much in common. For instance, the Mujahideen, the strugglers, the ones who go on jihad, were guerrilla fighters from around the world who came to Afghanistan to try and stop the Soviet Union's invasion in 1979. One of these Mujahideen, a Saudi Arabian named Osama bin Laden, would later found the international organization Al-Qaeda, the Foundation, in 1988. Bin Laden claimed that Al-Qaeda's goals were to expel non-Muslim military forces from traditional Islamic lands, most notably the American military from Saudi Arabia, and they also tried to remove non-Muslim economic and political entities from traditional Islamic countries, most especially the State of Israel. In Egypt, the Jamiat al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, is mostly a political movement in the more immediate sense, attempting to produce social changes through elections, education, and charities. The Muslim Brotherhood want to have republican forms of governance grounded in their interpretation of Islam. While occasionally being linked directly or indirectly with political violence, the Brotherhood has repeatedly denied any endorsement of violence against civilians. Now, regardless of whether and how the Muslim Brotherhood commits violence in any given case, their primary role has been as a political alliance, with committees, with guys in suits, and official chains of command. And they also have significant influence outside of Egypt as well, with a large number of elected officials in the governments of Sudan, Afghanistan, Palestine, Tunisia, and Yemen. Boko Haram, based in northern Nigeria and founded in 2002, tries to remove the influence of Western culture and politics there. Their immediate concern is with the presence of foreign cultural power. The name Boko Haram is literally a mixed phrase from Hausa and Arabic, meaning Western education is to be forbidden. And the group that calls itself Ad-Dawla al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wa Sham, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, called ISIL or ISIS in English, appeared around 1999 to fight Shiite political power in Syria, and then later in 2014 claimed to be trying to re-establish the caliphate. there are many other groups, and not a few individual agents, that we could also name here. But notice that the agendas of each of these groups is different. The Mujahideen were, and Boko Haram are, particular regional groups that have concerns that are, roughly speaking, local. Al-Qaeda is global, but is especially concerned with removing non-Muslims from Saudi Arabia and the Levant, especially Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood is global as well, but it is overwhelmingly trying to reshape societies through political activities, ideally creating Muslim-controlled republics. While ISIS is trying to reject Western systems of government altogether and create a caliphate. Between all these, there are only two common factors of note: political violence and Muslims. So that asks the question, what do all these different groups have to do with Islam? Now, I'm not going to try to resolve this issue for all time here. That would be reductive. There's no one cause alone that explains all these movements, Islam or anything else. Rather, let's just ask, how does Islam factor in? And as you're going to see, no matter how we argue, the result is problematic. All these groups, despite their differences, claim that Islam is a significant cause of their actions and motivations. There are plenty of passages in the Quran and many hadith that say that violence is sometimes justified. And there is in fact a whole history of Muslims fighting each other and fighting non-Muslims, and referring to this as a jihad on the path of God. Even Muhammad himself fought in battles after all. So if Muslims are to follow his sunnah, shouldn't they be allowed to fight too? Don't they have to fight too? Should it surprise us that many Muslims interpret Islam this way? Isn't this a literal interpretation of Islam? Well, no, it's not. For instance, the traditional sources of Islam, which all of these groups claim to be following, the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad, never address individual agents committing political violence, or even the existence of nation-states or even caliphates, or the killing of Muslims by other Muslims, or the killing of non-combatants. So these people aren't reading Islam any more literally than any other Muslim. They have a hermeneutics, just like everyone else does. If you look to the Quran or the Sunnah for discussions of jihad, all you're going to find are the intertribal confederations of Muslims, Jews, and pagans fighting over access to caravans and wells in the 7th century. If someone in the 21st century wants to argue that these make for justification for suicide bombing to cause the collapse of an economic system or a foreign parliament, they're going to have to perform some serious hermeneutical gymnastics. Remember that all of these groups, the Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram, ISIS, and all the others we didn't mention, are committing political violence. They are somehow, in any number of ways, dissatisfied with the present political, social, or economic order of things. Well, the overwhelming number of people who had their nations and cultures overturned by colonialism were Muslims. Islam is the second largest religion in the world, after all. So, after Christians, who themselves usually were the colonial powers, or at least benefited from them, by numbers alone, the people negatively affected by colonization were just statistically more likely to be Muslim. So if you're a Muslim today, it's almost certain that you're living under a political system that was either imposed on you by colonialism, or in the cases of Iran and Saudi Arabia, are or were dominated by colonial economic and cultural interests. So it shouldn't surprise us then that Muslims maybe are slightly more likely to become ensnared by violent movements in some way, right or wrong, groups that can try to correct for that lack of agency. And therefore, they can use Islam to justify such violence. Conversely, many people would claim that these violent groups and their actions have nothing to do with Islam at all. None of the traditional sources of Islam, the Quran or any of the Hadith, approve of Muslims indiscriminately killing non-Muslims. The Quran, in no uncertain terms, condemns killing yourself, so no suicide bombings or crashing a plane with yourself in it. And neither does the Quran or any hadith even discuss individuals or free-roaming groups committing violence independent of a government's orders. And the schools of fiqh, the four living Sunni schools, and the Shiite school all condemn killing non-combatants, children, women, or anyone killing anyone else without the authority of a recognized government. Likewise, statistically, Muslims are no more or less likely than anyone else to approve of violence against non-military persons. A 2011 worldwide Gallup poll of Muslims showed that 88% of Muslims worldwide say that violence against non-combatant civilians is never justified. A similar poll of Muslims, also globally, this one by the Pew Research Center in 2013, concluded that 72% of Muslims saying attacking civilians is never justified. And these numbers are comparable to the opinions of non-Muslims. Also in 2013, a worldwide Gallup poll asked people how they felt about killing civilians, with the results stating that 69% of people on Earth, Muslim or not, think a non-governmental body cannot rightfully kill civilians ever. So, just by these numbers, there doesn't seem to be a significant relationship between being Muslim and thinking that civilians can rightfully be killed for some reason or another. But these arguments that claim that there is no connection between Islam and violent movements all depend on authority claims. Just because a majority opinion says that someone doesn't speak for the group, that doesn't mean it's true. And just because the schools of fiqh, or the hadith, or even the Quran say something, that doesn't make it Islamic or not Islamic. If significant numbers of Muslims are actively committing violence against civilians, and they claim that it has something to do with their religion, we have to take that claim seriously, whether we agree with their hermeneutics of Islam or not. Part 3. The Unmosqued. Islam in America. Following in the wake of al-Qaeda's attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, many non-Muslim Americans started to ask themselves what Islam was, and whether and how Islam had something against American culture. Translations of the Quran became bestsellers, and news agencies regularly brought on so-called experts on Islam. But the history of Islam in America is not recent. Islam has been in the United States as long as there's been a United States. When the United States declared its independence in 1776, the first government to recognize this new nation was Morocco, and the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, signed by Sultan Muhammad ibn Abdullah and George Washington, remains in effect to this day. And when John Adams, in that same year, composed his Thoughts on Government, he argued that human dignity and the pursuit of happiness is a universal virtue by stating, "All sober inquirers after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue. Confucius, Zoroaster, Socrates, and Muhammad have agreed on this." In 1805, Thomas Jefferson himself hosted an iftar, a breaking of the Ramadan fast at sundown, in the White House for Muslim guests. And when Keith Ellison became the first Muslim to serve the United States Congress in 2007, he was sworn in on a Quran owned by Thomas Jefferson 2 centuries earlier. But even before the Revolution of 1776, there were sizable populations of Muslims living in what would become the United States. About a quarter of enslaved African Americans were Muslims, meaning that when America became its own nation, about 1 in 20 people in the country were either Muslim or the direct descendants of Muslims. Although most slaves were forced to convert to whatever form of Christianity was held by their owners, we can also detect traces of Islam lingering on, practiced in secret. There are Islamic slave narratives, some written in Arabic, both during the colonial period and after the revolution. For instance, in the autobiography of Al-Hajj Omar ibn Said, who was born in Senegal and enslaved in North Carolina, the author writes, "Before I came to the Christian country, my religion was the religion of Muhammad, the messenger of God. May God have mercy upon him and give him peace. I walked to the mosque before daybreak. I gave alms every year. I went on pilgrimage to Mecca. I have been in the country of the Christians 24 years. We have records of slaves and ex-slaves abstaining from pork and alcohol, as many Muslims tend to do, praying in the direction of Mecca, and following traditional Islamic burial practices by being buried facing Mecca. And even amongst African Americans whose families have for generations been Christian, distinctly Islamic names like Aisha, Malik, Jamal, and Aliyah remain, bearing witness to a Muslim past. After the formal end of slavery and the gradual process of African Americans pursuing civil rights began in earnest in the 20th century, many African Americans tried to reclaim their lost heritage. To this day, the largest ethnic population of Muslims in the United States are the African American descendants of the enslaved peoples of West Africa. Like manifestations of Islam everywhere, American Islam has been shaped by the distinct features of American history and culture. The most clear examples of this purely American Islam are the absences of the traditional Islamic forms of education and fiqh, and the accentuation of Islamic interpretations of personal liberty. Because slavery usually tore people away from their ancestral languages and literacy, the traditional Islamic forms of education are rare in the United States. Those schools and practices that do offer such training today are mostly recent introductions to America. Most American Muslims have no particular school of fiqh, as the formal interpretation of the Quran and God's Sharia depend on studying a large amount of written materials, especially the Hadith. Centuries of forced illiteracy and the absence of Islamic languages like Arabic made the study of fiqh simply impossible. In the place of these older forms of Islamic learning, new, uniquely American interpretations of Islam evolved instead. The most notable of these is the Nation of Islam, the NOI, founded in Detroit in 1930. During the middle of the 20th century, the Nation of Islam prioritized the role of African racial descent in Islamic identity, often fusing racial and religious belonging as a means of counteracting white Christian culture, which the NOI considered degenerate, if not actively evil. Rather than simply arguing against a colonial Western political order, the Nation of Islam wanted to purge the African American Muslim mind of colonized thoughts and practices. Civil rights leaders like Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, more famously known as Malcolm X, sprang out of the NOI's explicitly African American vision of Islam, although he would later reject their version of religion in favor of a more universal Sunni Islam. Around the same time that the Nation of Islam was formed, and also primarily in the Midwest, new Muslim immigrants, mostly of Arab origins, started to arrive in large numbers. The oldest still functioning Muslim prayer space in the United States opened in 1934 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It's commonly known by American Muslims today as the Mother Mosque of America. And as these Muslim Arab immigrants Americanized further over the generations, and they were joined by Muslims from other parts of Asia and Africa, they developed American Islams which, like the NOI, gave strong roles to personal liberty and individual agency. A famous example of this appeared in the form of American Muslim feminist Amina Wadud from Maryland. In most of the Islamic world, and for most of Islamic history, a woman could only lead a group prayer, that is, serve as an imama, if the congregation was only consisting of women. Women, some would argue, shouldn't be leading men in prayer. But in 2005, Wadud led a mixed gender prayer, much to the praise of Muslim feminists from around the world, and much to the scorn of anti-feminist Muslims too. Writing on this experience years later, Wadud rejected her critics for denying Islam the fluidity and adaptability to circumstances which had allowed it to survive around the world for so many centuries. These efforts are part of what can be termed a gender jihad. The pejorative meaning sometimes attached to the word jihad by both Muslim extremists and Western conservatives are intentionally overlooked here. Instead, jihad refers to effort, or exertion, and is here translated as struggle. The gender jihad is the struggle to establish gender justice in Islamic thought and praxis, the inclusion of women in all aspects of Muslim practice, performance, policy construction, and in both political and religious leadership, eradicating all practices, public and private, of injustice to women's full humanity in the name of Islam. Similar exclusionary and dehumanizing practices are directed towards non-Muslims, and increasingly, more towards non-heterosexual Muslims. Questions for class discussion. What is colonialism, and what are some of the ways it affects Muslims around the world? What are the strengths and weaknesses of arguments that violent movements are either entirely explained by Islam or have nothing to do with Islam? What are some of the unique ways that Islam manifested itself in American history?